So there are a couple of reasons I wanted to do this talk. One is because it's the 10th anniversary of BDD last year. And it's coming up to my 10th anniversary of becoming involved in it. So I wanted to look back and have a bit of a reflection on how it all started and how it's evolved. And it's evolved massively over 10 years. And I think some people have been left behind on that journey. So I wanted to redo that journey and to bring you guys along with me. It's my story, so it's necessarily a little bit self-promoting, but I'm also hoping that it will inspire you, and it will want you guys to get involved in this kind of thing as well, not just BDD, but whatever ideas you come across, other people's ideas, and take them and develop them and come up with your own as well. So it's a journey of somebody who started not a very good dev with 7 years experience. I was lucky enough to have enough of a brain to join ThoughtWorks. And that's pretty much where my career started. So imagine that I've got 7 years of development and I've learned almost nothing. I do not even own the Gang of Four Patterns book, right? That's how bad I am as a dev. I read refactoring or bits of refactoring while waiting for my interview at ThoughtWorks, okay? The story does actually start a little bit before I joined ThoughtWorks. So, I have to make apologies to Chris and Dan, who are two of my very good friends, Chris Metz and Dan North. And Dan came up with BDD. Chris was very heavily involved, particularly in the early days. I also have Shane too. So these guys have been doing it wrong. I've been doing it wrong. I also need to apologise to Dave Kalinski because he's got one slide in here where he did it wrong. And we've been doing it wrong for a very long time. And we've been telling everybody else how to do it, and we've been telling people wrong. So this is the evolution to something that's much, much better. So the second half of this talk, I'm going to show you what better looks like. Okay, so part one, first 40 minutes. This is what we did. 2003, that's such a long time ago. So BDD was something that Dan came up with, and he did it because he was trying to explain test-driven development to people and kept finding the word test got in the way. So BDD back in 2003 was essentially ATDD or TDD without the word test. And he had this little experiment he was doing where he took test in JUnit and he was replacing it with a framework that said should instead, right? So it just, you know how JUnit started with the word test? 3 point something or other. Now it's got annotations, but back in the day it started with the word test. He said start it with the word should. This class should do some stuff. So JBehave took something like test database and forced you to clarify what that meant. This class should save customer details. Now that's one of the 4 methods I've come across called test database. And they all did very, very different things. So this was really useful for getting people to describe what their code should do. That was how JBehave started. Unit level, class level, really simple. 2004. So Dan sat on this for about a year. Rachel said she heard him talking about it in 2003. I wasn't around. Chris Metz came along. He's an analyst. And Dan was trying to explain mock objects to Chris, who is not a dev, right? So Chris is looking at this and going, oh, so when you describe the behavior of this thing should do this stuff and should have this outcome, it only has it in this particular context. It should say, should save customer details to the database when they're valid. You know, that's the kind of thing it should say. And anyone who knows my take on BDD will know that I bang on about conversations quite a lot and how important it is to have a conversation. And if you were in the room 5 minutes ago, you would have heard me saying that. Okay? The should really refers to a conversation. Unfortunately, and this is straight from Chris's blog, this is what Chris reckons should have the conversation. Given this context provided by Module, the class, system, or component should have the following conversation. So this is a business analyst. As soon as you give code to anyone, even Chris Metz, people seem to forget that it's people who have conversations. And he's talking about pretend you're the code and pretend you're having a conversation about what you should do with another class. So we're thinking about responsibility principles and things like that. But still, Chris, okay, so this is wrong. People have conversations, okay? not code. But it does introduce the template, and this is a template that most of you who've done BDD will be familiar with. Hands up if you do some BDD. Have heard of BDD? Hands down if you've never heard of BDD before. Hands up, sorry, if you've never heard of BDD before. Careful when specifying behaviour. Okay, so I am going to introduce BDD. We're going to get more into the details of it in the second half. But just to share with you my take on BDD, here's an example of an example. Given Fred's bought a microwave costs £100. When we refund the microwave, Fred should be refunded £100. Really simple example, right? The thing about these examples is they're not generic. There is a specific guy who's buying a specific object for a specific price. And because of that, we can start thinking of other scenarios where something different might happen. So what might happen when Fred brings the microwave back? What happens?
They don't give him a refund.
Why don't they give him a refund?
It's broken.
Because it's broken, because he broke it, right? He dropped it on the floor and smashed the front. Nice one. Okay, so that's a good example. Here's another one. Given baby rabbits cost £10, when we sell Snowy the baby rabbit, the customer should be charged £10. Hands up if you've got an image of a little baby rabbit in your head. Little white baby rabbit, isn't it cute? Okay, so these things are very good for exciting the imagination and getting people to think and to explore. 2004 in November in fact, I joined ThoughtWorks. Yay! It was a massive milestone for me. And the week I joined ThoughtWorks, we had an away day at the weekend. And Dan presented JBehave to those of us who were there. And he said, got these PowerPoint slides, and they show you a unit testing framework and how it might work if it used should instead of test. And he's showing it on PowerPoint slides. Now, I'd been there for a week, and I was messing around with this Tetris game to learn TDD, because I didn't know TDD. And I thought, well, this looks like it's a really sensible idea, using the word should instead of test, and it'll help me think of the responsibilities of my code. So I picked up JBehave and replaced JUnit with the little bit of code I had. And it didn't work. So that might work, yeah? Might work. Yeah, so anyway, I sent this email to Dan. And this will give you an idea of how bad a dev I was. I was great at coding, but nothing else. So I fixed some bits of JBehave that weren't working. Please find the fixes below. And then I got a bit further and fixed a bit more. More fixes, here you go. And then I gave him more fixes, and there were about 5 this time. And you have to appreciate, I didn't know how to use version control. So I'm sending these fixes cut and pasted into the emails. So I get this thing back going, thank you for the fixes, they're really good. I've made you a committer on the project, stop bugging me, and please learn how to use Subversion and patches. Right? So that was my first real correspondence with Dan. After that, we ended up sitting together in the office quite a bit, so we were able to pair on this bit, and I got to overhear some of the conversations with Chris, which were really useful as well. 2005, great. Dave Astles wrote an article introducing BDD. Dan was very miffed about this because he realized he should have done that already, and he had explained it at some conference, and Dave had heard it, and Dave thought it was fantastic, so Dave gave it to the world. At the same time, I was having a discussion with people about NLP. So neurolinguistic programming, basically it's a technique where you look at words, and words have different associations and therefore different impact on people. And there's lots of stuff around aspects of NLP which, quite frankly, don't work. There are experimental evidence to prove that they don't work. But there's also bits of NLP which do work, and I think the word should is one of them. For anybody who doubts whether NLP works, I give you 2 horses, one named Thunder, one named Buttercup, and you already know how they behave. Okay? That's NLP. It's the associations we have with words. And it turns out that the word should has this impact on people. When you tell somebody you should do that, there's this little bit of the brain that gets all uppity and goes, no, no, I'm a grown adult now, don't tell me what to do. And it's one of these 6 ugly words that I was taught at that time, back in 2005, right, wrong, should, ought, control, and hold. And I thought, well, these are all very controlling words. They're words that you use to control other people's behaviour, and they are quite negative when you think of them in that way. So I wrote this whole blog post, and I wrote to the JBehave dev list, and I said, we shouldn't be using the word should. Notice what I did there. We use will, right? If we use will, behaviour isn't a limit imposed on code, but it's a contract in which I can have confidence. It's a specification. Now, you'll notice when I talk about BDD, I rarely use that word specification. I hardly ever use the word test. But at this point, I was thinking this. I was thinking, well, you want something with that level of certainty. You want this guarantee. So Dan let me and Sam Newman and a bunch of other people have this discussion for a while on the dev list, and then he butted in. And this is what he said. He said, why do I like the word should? It encourages debate and the constant questioning of the premise of the application you're developing. That was one of the aspects he said. It's quite a long email. And he was talking about embracing uncertainty when you have these discussions, when you have these conversations. I thought that was pretty magic. And I was utterly convinced, and I've never looked back. So I tend to use the word should quite a lot now. In fact, the human tendency to question, to push back on people telling you what you should do is incredibly useful for JBehave. It's incredibly useful for BDD because it encourages this questioning. It encourages us to rebel against the assumptions we're being given. I thought I'd throw this in there just to show you the kind of things that happen when you produce open source projects. So by this point, there's me working on it a lot, on JBehave quite a lot. There's Dan working on JBehave quite a lot. And we've also got Mauro Televi, who's nothing to do with ThoughtWorks. This ThoughtWorks manager, who shall remain nameless, decided he was going to have a little look at the project. So he looked at all the things which were in progress, which was documentation. Right, you know, tidying up the API and putting some API documentation in there and all the rest. And he sent this email, this nice little uppity email to Dan and I saying, I've just looked at what's in progress. Is this the tidiest project never to make it to 1.0? And I'm just sharing this with you to give you an idea of the kind of assumptions people make when you get involved in this. I sent him an email back going, did you look at the stuff that's done rather than in progress? What business is yours anyway? And by the way, we're just over the other side of the room, come and talk to us. And he didn't do that again. He left us to it. 2006. Dan finally wrote the article about BDD. This is a quote from it: behavior is a more useful word than test. So removing that word test enables people to question the code. And we've recently come to realize that what it really does, it keeps you in that problem space instead of jumping to the solution space. And this is really important for developers. If I give a developer half a problem, I will get a whole solution back. I know because I used to be a dev, right? I know what that feels like. You're really good at abstracting, really good at jumping to those solution ideas, those patterns that we know about and we can see. And sticking in that solution space, that problem space, making sure we understand the problem can give us, as well as a better idea of what solution we need, more options for finding a good solution as well, because it excites our imagination. That was the year that JUnit 4.0 came out. They got rid of having to start everything with word test. So I was on the Guardian project, we were going test should blah, 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 test should blah, 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 blah. Now it's an annotation, so we could actually start should blah, 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 blah. 2007, nothing else really happened in 2006. You'll notice JBehave still hasn't been released. 2007, finally, we got it out the door. I will show you what was in JBehave. So JBehave was the first of the BDD frameworks, and here's what was in it. The behavior runner, the unit level thing that runs all the should blah, blah, blahs for the classes. We had the story runner, so we had the very first given when then full system runner. But it ran using Java classes that were named given blah, blah, blah in camel case. So we also needed a printer that would print them out in English by stripping out the camel case and capitalizing the word I if it was on its own. And that's pretty much all it did. We had our own mocking framework, which also could mock classes. It was based on JMOC. Thank you, Steve and Nat, if they're around. I know they're at this conference. It had a swing harness. Oh, hey, Steve. He's at the back there. So Steve had a go at me because I've never been nice enough about JMOC. If it wasn't for JMOC, we wouldn't have any of the other mocking frameworks, okay? Eclipse plugins, just so you can run it in Eclipse. Ant tasks, because we like Ant. And finally, bane of my existence, Maven. Maven integration. So all of that was in JBehave 1. All of that. It was completely, totally unusable. Nobody ever used it. And I was trying to work out why nobody was adopting this thing. So I actually sat down and for a laugh, just for fun, I wrote the empty steps necessary to run the basic 3 rules of the game of life. Just the empty steps, no actual automation in them, no actual codes, just empty steps. So if you ran it, it would print out the behavior for the game of life and the scenarios. And it took 2 hours. I'm like, okay, well, that's why nobody's using it. But it was still fantastic because we could take it to conferences and we could talk about BDD and we got people having the conversations. It was great. And then they'd try and use the tool and they'd be like, oh, this is too hard. And they'd forget the tool, but they would still have the conversations. And it turned out there was quite a lot of value in that. This is what it looked like. Given an empty grid, extends given, and given was a JBehave class. And then you put your code in there. I just made the empty steps and it took 2 hours. Okay, so as well as JBehave, we also started kicking off the clones. There was an mbehave, Joe Campo. There was an rbehave, which Dan created. Paul, he was learning Ruby. It got renamed to RSpec's Story Runner. Oh yeah, there was RSpec as well, which did it at the unit level. And we almost made a Python obehave, but we didn't quite get round to that. Apparently Python likes funny names. I'm really sorry that we never had an obehave. That would have been funny. Okay, so Dave Chalinsky also that year rewrote the RSpec Story Runner. And I'm sorry, Dave, but I think this is the point at which BDD went inevitably downhill from here on in. This is the most wrong thing that ever happened in BDD. He wrote it because it's in Ruby. So originally, RSpec Story Runner, did the same thing as JBehave, given underscore, blah, 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 because you use underscores in Ruby. And he went, yeah, but this is Ruby, we can just use strings. Given, quote, a string. We can just do that. That's brilliant. Okay. But you know what? If we're going to use strings, we might as well use a text file. And he converted it to use plain text. And this was the beginnings of what we now call the Gherkin syntax. So he made it use plain text, which made it usable. It made it usable. Also that year, Stepan Faber wrote Mockito. Now, I still maintain it was a present for me. We were on the Guardian project at the time, and he caught me rolling out my own mocking framework, and he said, Liz, why are you rolling out your own mocking framework? And I said, because I want to do BDD, and JMock and EasyMock both insist you go given, expect, when, then go back and verify your expectations. And it just doesn't fit with the way I'm doing given, when, then at a unit level. So I'm rolling out my own. And Stepan's this tall Czech guy, huge hands, he slams the table, he goes, this is ridiculous, mocking framework shall work better than this, I'm going to write one. And went home and wrote Mockito over the weekend, the way you do. But he wrote it for me. And we used this at the Guardian and it was very successful. But it does fit that BDD style. It was originally based on EasyMock, which wouldn't have existed without JMock. Thank you, Steve. Okay, I have heard that there is now some pushback against Mockito. I don't know where that's come from, but if anybody wants to fill me in later, please do. It's been a while. Maybe we're doing mocking all wrong as well. 2008. Revisiting JBehave. So I had a little look at JBehave. We didn't need the behavior runner because JUnit 4 was pretty good, and you could just start methods with the word should, and it was much more mature, and all the tools was there, all the support was there, all the different reporters were in place. We couldn't compete with that. We didn't need those because of Mockito. So, our mocking framework was awful. Mockito was pretty good, ours was not. We didn't need the ANT tasks, unfortunately, because we were slowly moving towards Maven. More on that later. The swing harness didn't really belong there. I extracted it out into its own little library, which is called Tyben, because it helps you swing more easily. 1 or 2 groans, history buffs in the room. And all that was left was the story runner and printer and the stuff to make that run. That was the only thing that BDD did that nothing else did, that BDD tools did that nothing else did. The system level, given when then scenarios that we're now really familiar with. So I rewrote JBehave completely. Deleted the code base. This is like the thing you're not meant to do with Agile, but sometimes it's appropriate. And sometimes when you write something new for the first time, somebody makes it better, and they make this bit better, they make this bit better, and suddenly you're only left with one tiny bit, if anything. And it is time to retire that behavior. It's time to retire that thing that's valuable, because it's not valuable anymore. So I rewrote it, and God knows I wish I had seen the future, because this was the second most awful point in BDD's history. It made JBehave useful. And people started using JBehave as well. I also rewrote the Wikipedia page. So I was out in India at the time, and I kept getting these questions, and people were obviously being confused by what was a very poor page. So I wrote it, and then when I got back to the UK, I found somebody had taken Dan's name out. I said, BDD was conceived in 2003 by Dan North, and that had gone. The by Dan North had gone. So I put it back, cited a few things to make sure it stayed. And I said this to Dan. I said, look, who on earth has got it in for you and is taking your name out? He said, yeah, that was me. I'm like, stop that. Not allowed anymore. So I made him keep it in. Okay. Also, one of the most exciting things to happen this year, 2008. I was talking to somebody at a ThoughtWorks evening event about BDD. They said, Liz, I've got this problem, really big problem. We want to do BDD, we can't find anybody to have these conversations with, and I know you're really big on the conversations. They said, well, what are you doing with the scenarios? I said, making them up. I'm like, oh, God. Okay, so there must be somebody who cares about the project. Do you have a business analyst? Well, yes. Well, can you talk to them about the scenarios? No, because they're making them up too. Fantastic. Who is paying for the project? Is there a sponsor? Yes. Right, does the sponsor care about the project? No. Well, hold on. This is the guy who's managed to fight to get the budget for the project. It's like, yep. And he doesn't care what you're spending it on. No. Well, why on earth has he created this project in the first place? And this lady said, he's just trying to use up his budget for that quarter so he can get it again next quarter. And I went, BDD doesn't solve that problem. But feature injection came along. And I promptly adopted this as part of the BDD body of logic. It was Chris Matz who created it, same analyst who was talking about mock objects ages ago. And you might recognize this template. If any of you have seen the as a I want so that, Mike Cohn says the so that's optional. Chris says, no, it isn't. Put it at the top. In order to achieve this goal, if you have not got a goal for which you are creating the feature, don't flipping do it. Now, Chris talked a lot about hunting the value and finding the most valuable thing that was on the project. And every single other thing you do should be there because you get the value out. And he called it feature injection after dependency injection. You don't just stuff all the dependencies into a class just in case you need them. But at that point in time, people were doing that with Scrum. They were doing that with Agile projects because they were used to only having one chance to sign up for stuff. So they'd have this big bucket of requirements which you'd then prioritize, right? It's like a Gantt chart in slices turned on its side. I mean, that was how most Scrum backlogs were being created. And he said, no, just find the thing that's valuable and then identify absolutely everything that you need to get that value out and nothing more. So it's the first look I ever had at this idea of an MVP, a smallest thing you could possibly do that was valuable. JBehave 2 got released. I'm so sorry. I'm really so sorry. More about that later as well. 2009. Dan came up with this definition of BDD. BDD is a second generation outside-in, pull-based, multiple stakeholder, multiple scale, high automation agile methodology. It describes a cycle of interactions with well-defined outputs, resulting in the delivery of working, tested software that matters. Now, he then went on to explain this for about an hour and a half. I'm not going to do that because we've only got an hour and half an hour of that's already gone. Some of it makes sense. So second generation, it's based on TDD. Outside in means we start from the user perspective, go in. Pull-based means we only do what we need. Multiple stakeholder, there are lots of people who need stuff. Multiple scale, we were doing it at a low level and a high level, and now we've got feature injection as well. High automation, we'll come to that in a moment. Agile methodology. Right, a methodology to me is just a body of knowledge and language around a subject. That's all a methodology is. It's all any ology is, right? It's just there as an anchor term. So BDD is not a do this and you will be successful. It's a here are some ideas and we found them useful in these different contexts. And you make your own process and use some common sense. My other computer's got a lovely sticker on the back of it that says Agile doesn't come with a brain, use yours. So it describes a cycle of interactions with well-outlined outputs, resulting in the delivery of working, testing software that matters. Okay? There are two little bits here that we realize later on, much, much later, cause problems. One is the high automation. More on that later. And one is the well-defined outputs. And that's a really interesting one. So when I talk in the second half, I will be talking about why those are an issue. And I will be showing you what to do instead. I also wrote a lovely little blog post called Pixie-Driven Development that year, where I said, look, if you can describe the behavior in terms of pixies, it's all good, right? So the idea was to stop devs worrying about how they were going to solve the problem and to stay more in that problem space. So you have to imagine you're getting money out of a cash machine, and instead of software inside the cash machine, there is a little pixie counting out the money and pushing it through. And if you read Terry Pratchett and his cameras, so when he takes a photo, there's a little gnome, paints a picture, and it's like that, right? That's what's happening on your monitors. There's a gnome inside your monitor that's painting stuff for you so you can see what's going on. It's not software. Get your head out the software. It's pixies. It's all just pixies. So this is pixie-driven development. And the idea is that eventually you have to replace it with real code. So I'm talking to my pixie, who's Thistle, and I'm like, well, you're not much use, are you? And Thistle says, well, look, if I wasn't around, you'd have code that was easy to write instead of code that was easy to use. And the idea is we don't worry about how we're going to implement it. We worry about how we want to use it. And I left ThoughtWorks. Struck out as an independent, ostensibly to write some fantasy fiction. The book I was working on got shelved. The book I subsequently worked on, I released December, while I was out in Australia. So if you go to LeanPub, you can find my fantasy fiction novel. I will warn you, it's one of 4 parts, so it's only the first book of 4. But Corey Haynes read it, and he says he likes it, and George Dinwiddie can't wait to get the next one, so it's good. I'm happy. Right, so anyway, I left ThoughtWorks, and I have managed to publish some fantasy fiction, so I'm very happy with that. That was also the year that Chris Matz came up with Real Options. I worked with some really bright people, right, and hang around with some really bright people. So he came up with this idea that having choices in life is valuable. And in the second half, I'll show you how this is applicable to BDD. But basically, don't make commitments early, and you can pay to extend commitments. That's the idea. You can pay to delay that moment of commitment, either until you've got more information to make a better decision, or until you have to make a decision anyway, at which point, if you didn't get the information, make the decision that's easiest to change, because then it's less of a commitment. Okay, if anyone wants to quiz me about Real Options, I love them. I live by them. I'm not going to go into them in detail now, because it's 2010. They're not user stories. This was another blog post I wrote. Hands up if you use user stories. As a user, I want this, so that. Okay. I'm going to give you a really simple example of why they're not user stories. As a user, I want the cash machine to debit my bank account so that, whoa, hold on. I don't want that, right? The bank wants that. The bank wants that. Other users want that. I don't want that, not as the user of the cash machine. It's something that we know has to happen because there's another stakeholder who has a need. Another stakeholder has a need. At one of the big Agile conferences, there was a keynote about UI design and user interaction. And the gentleman told a story of this particular company who managed to change their user registration process from being 5 pages to just 2, and promptly went bust because they had forgotten about all the ad impressions on those pages that they had just lost. So it's not for the benefit of the user. And JBehave 3 released with more Maven. And I never touched it again. I found Maven was just a bit too nasty and a bit too much of a learning curve, and I had some other things I was getting on with. I was doing a lot of coaching. So Maro and Paul Hammond, Maro Televi and Paul Hammond took it, and they've been working with it ever since. And I haven't touched it since JBehave 2 point something. There you go. I still get lots of work based on the fact that I'm a JBehave dev, which is great, but I'm not anymore. Also that year, Dan published Deliberate Discovery, a blog post called Deliberate Discovery. And this was, as opposed to accidental discovery, so it's very strongly related to real options, this idea that you go out and deliberately discover the information you need to make good decisions. But if you do read the blog post, it's got this lovely, lovely quote to illustrate this idea that learning is our constraint. So if any of you are into theory of constraints, hands up if you're familiar. Hands up if you're not familiar with theory of constraints. Okay, very quick lesson. There's a house on fire over there, and we're making a bucket line around this front row. What's your name? Andrew. Andrew, okay, so Andrew is the slowest person in the line. Sorry, Andrew. And as we bring the buckets round from the river, we get two up, and then they start piling up, right? And Andrew's panicking, so he's spilling water everywhere, and we're tripping over the buckets because they're starting to build up. So the idea is that that bucket line can never go faster than the constraint in the system. And if Andrew is the constraint, the thing to do is to wait until he's free to take a bucket and then give him one. And then we don't spill it, or we have a limit on buckets in progress. Right, so we say we'll only put 2 beside you, and if you're full, we'll wait. Or you put him down by the river, and then the whole line moves very smoothly. But when we're talking about software, it's not like a car factory where you're piling the same car out over and over and over and over again. It's more like product development. We're creating a new car. And in product development, knowledge discovery is your constraint. Now, Dan says ignorance is your constraint. I always think of it as learning, knowledge discovery, the machine that turns your ignorance into stuff that lets you make decisions, into information. And if you can focus on learning, you will go faster. Dan had this lovely quote in the article from bash.org. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge, Charles Darwin. And the response that came back was, what the hell, begets isn't a word, quit trying to make up words, and who said something very rude. Which was just brilliant. I love this so much. And honestly, we don't notice our ignorance. We don't know what we don't know. Do you remember the well-defined outputs? You can start seeing it coming in. And this was the point at which we started to get this idea that we were doing something wrong. This was also the year that Dan and I did a talk. And he came to Skills Matter to do the talk. And as we do, we never prep these things. We met up in the cafe beforehand. And I usually have a slide deck, and we usually juggle some slides around and then wing it. And it works beautifully. Don't ask me how it works, it just does. But Dan said, look, Liz, before we start, I have to tell you something, and I'm not sure you're going to like it. And I said, have you been telling people not to do the automation? And he went, yes. And both of us independently this year started finding out that the automation was causing more problems than it was solving. People were forgetting to have the conversations. They were jumping on those tools. Remember I said how sorry I was that I made those tools usable? People were no longer having the conversations because we'd made the tools usable. And as soon as they put the scenarios in the tools, they were done. And it was pervasive. Most of the people I met doing BDD were doing this and struggling really badly as a result. Because it turns out that automation and the work you need to make automation work is a commitment. And if you haven't spoken to somebody, you're committing to the wrong thing. Oh, sorry, skipped a bit. 2011, yeah. So the Cucumber book came out, which does actually talk a lot about conversation. It's really good. But Cucumber was also out then. It had been online for a while, so this had been floating around for some time. Cucumber is now the de facto BDD framework that people are most familiar with, largely because of the Cucumber book. You'll notice that when Dave Chilimsky converted the Aspect Story Runner framework, which was a precursor to Cucumber, he used login as a scenario, and now we've got the calculator as a scenario. Yeah, I'll revisit that later as well. And then Dan and I finally got round to doing the talk based on his blog post and my blog post, Deliberate Discovery, Step Away from the Tools, for goodness sakes. And we talked to people about the need for that conversation and for embracing uncertainty and for having quick discussions where you could just throw the examples away because they were wrong. 2012. I did a talk called When Outcomes Don't Come Out. It's still available on the Skills Matter site. And one of the things I said, so this was when I was starting to learn about Cynefin, which is a sense-making framework for understanding uncertainty. And I realized that all the value is in things which are new and have never been done before. And usually, if you talk to the business, they don't know what the outcomes of some scenarios will be. And what was happening was people were pushing back on that. And I said, if you ever find the business have uncertainty about scenarios, jump on it. Because that's your risk. That's the area of higher discovery. Make something, get it out there. Try and get some feedback on some stuff. Don't sit there trying to thrash out analysis when you can't. Somebody who was in the audience, a friend overheard them talking and reported this to me. They said that I had set the industry back 7 years with this talk because I had taken away the illusion of certainty that we'd given people with BDD. We'd given them this lovely illusion that you could specify everything with scenarios, everything, 4-hour-long planning meetings, right? And now I had taken that away. And that makes a lot of devs really uncomfortable because if you can't be told exactly what to do, how do you behave? More on that when I talk in the second half. So this is Cynefin. I will be covering this in some detail. Just to let you know, we have emergent outcomes here. So these outcomes are emergent on this side, uncertainty. And over this side, you have experts involved. And BDD works really well in the bit in between. And I'll be talking more about that as well. 2013. So this is last year. This is now, we're moving into the 10th anniversary of BDD. It's only just gone. Last year, finally Dan tells me there's no such thing as declarative and imperative. So this is a thing we keep talking about, how you talk about scenarios in terms of a higher level of abstraction than the UI. Don't get bogged down in button presses and text box entries. Talk about it in terms of what you're achieving, what capability you're providing somebody. And Dan pointed out that there's no such thing. So we do talk at a very low level when we're dealing with code, and then we talk at a higher level when we're dealing with business analysts, and then we talk at a higher level when we're dealing with domain experts, and a higher level beyond that when we're talking with peripheral stakeholders, until you get to the point where you're trying to make a company some money. And that is a higher level of abstraction still. And then you've got one where you're doing good for society and creating jobs and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of levels of abstraction in which you can talk about the work you're doing. I went, oh yeah. But it's taken me till last year to realize that. So I thought I would let you know I'm still learning. I also created a blog post called Capability-Based Planning. So this is about the capabilities you're giving somebody. Now, BDD is phrased in terms of capabilities if you do it right. You know, the ability to tell somebody they need an umbrella because it's going to rain, for instance. But this is from the blog. If in doubt, try to get something live early because there's nothing like being wrong to find people who will tell you what right looks like. And I share this with you now because I'm still finding that some of the things I'm doing are wrong. So please come and tell me what right looks like. Preferably stay for the second half if you're going to do that. 2014. 2014 has already been quite exciting for me. I wrote 2 new blog posts, BDD for legacy systems, and continuous and discrete capabilities, which is basically about non-functionals, and BDD for ops and monitoring. So these are things I should have written ages ago, and I finally got around to doing last month. And we've defined BDD again. It's writing software that matters. If you find you're not writing software that matters, either BDD is wrong or you're doing it wrong, and I'm going to suspect the second, but it's okay. We always do it wrong, and we've been doing it wrong for 10 years. And this is the most wrong thing in BDD. Dan North said it was just a thought experiment. He never expected anybody to actually make it work. Thank you very much.